The rain was coming down in sheets of ice, blurring the neon sign of the diner into a jagged smear of red and white. Inside, the air smelled of burnt grease and old cigarettes, but it was the silence that caught my attention, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that happens right before a storm breaks. I saw the kid first, a guy half my age with a neck as thick as a bridge timber and a jacket that cost more than my first rig, looming over a man who looked like he'd been carved out of dry hickory. The old-timer was wearing a faded ball cap with Vietnam Veteran stitched in gold, and his hands were shaking as he tried to pick up a dropped thermos. Then the kid laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender, and shoved the veteran back against a booth with a force that made the silverware rattle. I felt my grip tighten on my coffee mug, my knuckles turning white, as the kid leaned in and spat a curse that echoed through the dead silent room. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The Peterbilt was idling outside in the darkness, a low, rhythmic thrumming I could feel in the soles of my boots, even through the cracked linoleum of the diner floor. That steady diesel pulse was usually my anchor, the sound that kept me grounded when the world got too loud or too quiet. But tonight, all my focus was locked on the back of that kid's head, on the arrogant tilt of his shoulders and the way he stood over Artie like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. He was dressed in high-end tactical gear, the kind of stuff guys wear when they want to look dangerous without ever having seen a day of actual dirt or blood. The fabric was pristine, the zippers gleaming under the fluorescent lights, every pocket and strap placed with magazine-spread precision. He was tall, maybe 6'4", with the kind of build that came from expensive personal trainers and supplement regimens. His boots were the dead giveaway, though. $500 tactical footwear that had never walked through anything worse than a parking garage puddle. They were spotless, the tread still sharp enough to read the manufacturer's logo. The old man, whose name tag on his work shirt read Artie in faded stitching, was gasping against the vinyl of the corner booth. He looked fragile, like a bird with a broken wing, all hollow bones and thin skin stretched too tight over a frame that had once been solid. His flannel shirt was threadbare at the elbows, and I could see the tremor in his weathered hands. The kind that comes from age, maybe medication, maybe just the weight of too many years carrying too much. But his eyes weren't full of fear. That's what struck me hardest. They were full of a weary, bone-deep disappointment, the kind that comes from watching the world forget the sacrifices men like him had made. He'd seen this before, maybe 100 times, in 100 different places. Young men with no respect, no understanding, no connection to the price that had been paid for their freedom to be arrogant. I didn't move yet. I just watched, my coffee cooling in my hand, my back pressed against the cracked vinyl of my own booth. In this business, you learn that jumping in too early can escalate a situation before you have the full layout, before you understand all the variables. You wait, you observe, you calculate, but you also learn where the line is, that invisible boundary between intervention and complicity. And I could feel that line getting closer with every second. The kid reached out, his hand like a meat hook, fingers thick and graceless. He grabbed the brim of Artie's veteran cap, the fabric worn soft from years of wear, the gold stitching dulled by time and sun. He yanked it off with a casual cruelty that made my jaw tighten, tossing it onto the floor where a puddle of melted slush was spreading from the doorway. The cap landed with a wet slap, immediately soaking up the dirty water mixed with road salt and whatever else had been tracked in from the parking lot. "You're in my way, Gramps," the kid sneered, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. He was performing now, feeding off the silence, the shocked stillness of the other patrons. Some of us actually have places to be, important places, not just taking up space in a booth waiting to die. He gestured dramatically around the nearly empty diner, as if the peeling wallpaper and flickering lights proved his point about importance and value. Artie reached for his hat, his fingers trembling worse now, extending toward it like he was trying to reclaim a piece of his dignity along with the fabric. But the kid saw the movement and kicked the cap further away, his expensive boot sending it sliding across the floor right under a radiator where the grease was thickest, where years of cooking oils had congealed into a dark, sticky residue. I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest, a slow burn ember that usually stays buried deep under years of road miles and missed sleep, under the discipline I'd learned in places where losing your temper meant losing your life. My hand tightened around the ceramic mug, and I had to consciously relax my grip before the handle cracked. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the lukewarm bitterness ground me, buying myself a few seconds to think. The diner itself was one of those forgotten roadside places that had seen better decades, the kind where the menu hadn't changed since 1985, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewing since then too. The booths were covered in red vinyl that had been patched with duct tape more times than I could count. The floor tiles were cracked and yellowed, and the whole place had that permanent smell of grease that gets into everything, into the curtains and the walls, and probably into the souls of the people who worked here. There were maybe 6 other people in the place, 2 drivers at the counter, both staring down at their plates like they could will themselves invisible. An elderly couple in a corner booth, the woman clutching her husband's hand with white knuckles. And the young waitress couldn't have been more than 19, 100 pounds soaking wet, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of double shifts and unpaid bills. She tried to step in, God bless her. She moved toward the kid with her hands up in a placating gesture, her voice shaking but determined. "Sir, please." He didn't do anything. He was just getting his refill. He's been a regular here for years. "Please, just..." The kid turned on her so fast she flinched, his face contorting into something ugly and mean. His neck flushed red, veins standing out against his skin. "Did I ask you?" he roared, and I watched her recoil like she'd been slapped. "Get back to the kitchen before I decide you're part of the problem, before I call your manager and have you fired for interfering with customers." He stepped closer to her, using his size to intimidate, his shadow swallowing her whole. She backed up until she hit the counter, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. She was fighting to hold back. He was a bully, plain and simple, the kind that thrives on the silence of others, on the learned helplessness of people who've been beaten down by a system that protects money and status over basic human decency. That's when I set my mug down. The clink of ceramic on the laminate table seemed to ring out like a bell in the heavy silence. Several heads turned toward me, but I didn't acknowledge them. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my lower back, the dull ache that was my constant companion after 12 hours of hauling a heavy load through the Ozark passes. The vertebrae popped and crackled like dry kindling, a reminder that I wasn't the young operator I used to be. But I'm heavier now, denser, and I know exactly where the weight goes when I need it to. I walked over, my boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the linoleum, the kind of footsteps that announce intention without words. Each step was measured, controlled, the walk of a man who's done this before, who's faced down threats in darker places than a roadside diner. I didn't say anything until I was standing 2 feet behind him, close enough to smell the expensive cologne he'd probably applied in some climate-controlled gym locker room, mixed now with the sharper scent of nervous sweat. "The hat," I said. My voice was low, gravelly from years of diesel fumes and cigarettes I'd quit a decade ago, but could still taste. It was the kind of quiet that usually makes smart people turn around and reconsider their choices. "Pick it up." The kid froze for a second, his shoulders tensing. Then he turned slowly, deliberately making a show of it. He looked me up and down with eyes that had been taught to assess value in dollar signs and social status. He saw my grease-stained Carhartt jacket with the torn elbow I kept meaning to patch. He saw the lines around my eyes, the grey threading through my beard, the calluses on my hands. He saw a middle-aged truck driver with a gut and probably a mortgage, someone he could dismiss as easily as he'd dismissed Artie. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face, the kind of smile that had never been wiped off by consequences. "Or what, old man?" He tilted his head, amused by his own wit. "You gonna haul me away in your little toy truck? You gonna bore me to death with stories about the good old days?" I didn't blink. I didn't react to the provocation. I just looked past him at Artie, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between hope and fear, between gratitude and concern. The old man's hands were gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white with the effort. "Artie, you okay?" I asked, my eyes never leaving the veteran's face. "I'm fine, Jack," the old man whispered, though his voice cracked on the second word. There was a wetness to his breathing, a wheeze that spoke of COPD or emphysema or one of the other souvenirs that came from breathing Agent Orange 40 years ago. Don't get yourself hurt over a hat. It's just a hat. I can get another one." But we both knew it wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol, a statement, a small piece of identity that said, "I served, I sacrificed, I matter." And watching it soak in greasy water while some entitled kid laughed was more than either of us could stomach. The kid laughed again, the sound harsh and grating, and reached out to shove me the same way he'd shoved Artie, a straight-arm push meant to send me stumbling backward, to re-establish the dominance he felt slipping away. He moved fast, with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged, never had his aggression met with superior force. But I've spent 20 years reacting to jackknives and black ice, to deer jumping onto highways at midnight, to brake failures on mountain grades. My reflexes aren't what they used to be, but they're still wired for survival, still tuned to respond to threats before my conscious mind fully processes them. I didn't retreat. I stepped into his space instead, my lead shoulder meeting his chest before his arm could fully extend, before he could get his weight behind the push. It wasn't a punch. I hadn't thrown a punch yet. It was just a shift of mass, a redistribution of force that used his own momentum against him. He stumbled back, his expensive boots slipping slightly on the grimy floor, his eyes widening as he realized that his size advantage didn't mean as much as he'd thought. He hit the edge of a table, the impact rattling the salt and pepper shakers, a half-empty water glass sloshing over onto the laminate surface. "You touched me," he hissed, and the arrogance was curdling now into a sharp, jagged rage, the kind that comes from humiliation, from having your worldview challenged in front of witnesses. His face was flushing darker, purple creeping up from his collar. "You have no idea who you just laid hands on. You have no concept of the kind of trouble you just bought yourself." His hand moved then, fast and deliberate, reaching into his jacket. The movement made my heart rate spike, adrenaline hitting my system like a shot of high-octane fuel dumped straight into the engine. I've seen that motion before, in checkpoints and back alleys, in places where a split second determined who went home and who went into a body bag. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. Training took over, muscle memory from a life I'd mostly left behind. I lunged forward, my hand shooting out to grab his wrist before whatever he was reaching for could clear the fabric. My other hand went to his throat, not squeezing, not yet, just controlling, just establishing dominance. I pinned him against the wall with enough force to make the framed pictures of pancakes and omelets shudder in their cheap frames. The kid's eyes went wide, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks as I drove my weight into him, using my center mass to keep him immobilized. I could feel the hard shape of something metal under his jacket, and my grip tightened reflexively. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to have the room to draw it. Not while I had control of his arm. He tried to bring his free hand up to gouge at my eyes, a dirty fighting technique, the kind you learn on the street or in self-defense classes taught by people who've never been in a real fight. But I caught his forearm mid-motion, my fingers wrapping around the thick muscle, and twisted it down and back until the leverage forced him to bend at the waist. He let out a sharp, choked yelp that was equal parts pain and outrage, the sound of someone who'd never experienced real physical consequences for their actions. My heart was hammering a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs, the kind of beat that tells you you're past the point of no return, that whatever happens next, there's no walking it back. The diner had gone absolutely silent, except for the hum of the refrigerators and the steady tick of the clock above the register. I could feel every eye on us, could sense the collective held breath of everyone in the room. "I don't care who you are," I said, my voice low and vibrating against his chest where my shoulder pressed into him. "In this room, in this moment, you're just a guy who stepped on a man who's earned more respect in a single day than you'll see in your entire lifetime." He spat at me, a desperate, animalistic move from someone who realized they were physically outmatched, who was running out of options and dignity in equal measure. The spittle caught my cheek, and I felt a flash of genuine anger cut through the controlled aggression. He kicked out wildly, his heavy boot catching me in the shin with enough force to send a white-hot flare of pain shooting up my leg. The impact almost made me lose my grip, my hands loosening for just a fraction of a second, but a fraction was all he needed. Taking advantage of the half-second, I wavered. He threw his shoulder forward with a guttural roar that was more rage than strategy, breaking my hold with sheer, desperate strength. He lunged toward the door, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the slick floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't over," he screamed, his voice cracking with humiliation and fury. "You have no idea what you just started, no idea who you're dealing with." He burst through the glass door, the cheap aluminum frame rattling in protest. The freezing rain swirled into the diner for a brief moment, a blast of Arctic air that made everyone gasp, before the pneumatic closer pulled the door shut with a hollow thud. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look at Artie or the waitress or any of the other frozen faces staring at me. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing or why. I just followed him out into the night, into the storm, because some part of me knew that letting him run meant letting him regroup, letting him come back with reinforcements or weapons or whatever resources someone like him had access to. The parking lot was a minefield of deep puddles and slick oil patches, the kind of surface that's treacherous even in good conditions. The cold air hit my lungs like a physical weight, like breathing in broken glass. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since I'd gone inside, and the rain had transformed into a freezing sleet that stung any exposed skin. I saw him scrambling toward a blacked-out SUV parked near the edge of the lot, away from the lights, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people made in 2 years. His boots were slipping on the asphalt, his arms windmilling for balance, and I realized he wasn't used to running, wasn't used to physical exertion that his money couldn't shortcut. "Get back here," I yelled, my breath blooming in the cold air like smoke from a dragon's mouth. My voice echoed off the concrete walls of the diner, bouncing back at me from the darkness. He reached the driver's side door, fumbling for the handle with hands that were shaking from adrenaline or cold or both. But I was faster than he expected for a man my age and size, faster than his assumptions about out-of-shape truckers had led him to believe. I closed the distance in 5 long strides, my boots finding purchase where his had slipped, and tackled him just as his fingers closed around the door handle. We both hit the wet pavement with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the air from my lungs and sent pain radiating through my shoulder. We rolled through a freezing puddle that had to be 6 inches deep, the slush soaking into my clothes instantly, the shock of the cold water making my muscles seize. But I kept my hands on him, kept my weight pressing down, because letting go meant losing every advantage I had. He was younger and desperation makes people strong in ways training never can. He managed to plant a knee in my gut, driving it upward with enough force to knock the wind out of me. My diaphragm spasmed, trying to remember how to pull in air, and stars danced at the edges of my vision. He scrambled up, slipping twice before finding his footing, but instead of getting in the car and fleeing like a smart person would have, he reached through the open window. His hand emerged holding a heavy tactical flashlight, the kind that doubles as a bludgeon, with a strike bezel designed to break windows and bones with equal efficiency. The first blow caught me across the shoulder as I was trying to stand. A dull thud that made my entire arm go numb from the impact point down to my fingertips. The flashlight had to weigh 3 pounds of aircraft-grade aluminum, and he swung it like he was trying to knock my head off my shoulders. I ducked the second swing on pure instinct, the metal casing whistling past my ear close enough that I could feel the displaced air. If that had connected with my skull, this fight would have been over, and not in my favor. I drove forward, lowering my center of gravity, and rammed my head into his midsection with everything I had left. The impact lifted him off his feet, his body going horizontal for a moment before gravity reasserted itself. I slammed him back against the side of his own vehicle, the metal groaning and buckling under the combined force of our weight and momentum. A dent appeared in the pristine black paint, a crater the size of a dinner plate that would cost thousands to repair. I grabbed the hand holding the flashlight and slammed it against the doorframe once, twice, 3 times, each impact punctuated by the metallic ring of aluminum on steel. On the 3rd strike, his fingers finally loosened and the flashlight clattered to the pavement, rolling away into the darkness beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. He was gasping now, his face pale in the flickering yellow light of the sodium lamps, his expensive jacket torn at the shoulder seam. Blood was trickling from a cut on his lip where he'd bitten through it during the impact, the dark red looking almost black against his skin. "You're dead," he wheezed, and there was less bravado in his voice now, more genuine fear bleeding through the anger. "You have no idea what's coming for you, what I can bring down on your head." I pinned his wrists to the roof of the car, my forearms trembling with the effort of keeping him controlled, keeping him from landing any more blows. "I've been hearing that for 30 years, kid," I told him, my voice rough from exertion and cold. "Usually from people who ended up exactly where you are right now, flat on their backs, wishing they'd made different choices." I reached into his jacket with my free hand, fishing for whatever he'd been reaching for inside the diner. My fingers closed around something hard and angular, and I pulled it out into the light. It wasn't a firearm like I'd feared. It was a high-end signal jammer, the kind used by security details and people who didn't want their conversations intercepted, paired with a military-grade encrypted radio. My blood went cold, despite the adrenaline still burning through my system. This wasn't just some rich kid with an attitude problem and poor impulse control. This was someone with access to equipment that civilians shouldn't have, to technology that suggested connections to either military, intelligence, or private security at levels that made my gut churn. The rain was coming down harder now, transitioning from freezing sleet to a slushy mix that stung my skin like tiny needles. The temperature was still dropping, and I could see my breath coming in thick clouds that hung in the air before being torn apart by the wind. That's when I felt it, a vibration through the asphalt that had nothing to do with passing trucks or the storm. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that made the teeth in my head rattle, that I could feel in my sternum and my spine. It was a frequency I recognized from another life, from extraction zones and hot LZs. "Who are you?" I demanded, tightening my grip on his wrists until he winced. What kind of trouble did I just step into? The kid started to laugh, a bloody, hysterical sound that sent a chill down my spine more effectively than the ice and wind ever could. It was the laugh of someone who knew something I didn't, who was operating with information I lacked. "There they are," he managed between gasps. "Now you're going to see what happens when you touch the wrong person. Now you're going to learn about consequences." A searchlight cut through the dark like the finger of God, blinding us both, turning the falling sleet into a curtain of diamonds that sparkled and danced in the beam. The light was so intense it whited out my vision, made me raise one hand to shield my eyes even as I kept the other locked on the kid's wrist. The downward force of the rotors hit us like a physical wall, nearly knocking us both over, sending trash and loose gravel flying through the air like shrapnel. A paper coffee cup tumbled past, followed by a plastic bag that had probably been trapped under a dumpster for months. The wind was so strong it was hard to breathe, hard to keep my eyes open against the debris and the rotor wash. I looked up, squinting against the glare and the wind, and saw the dark, predatory shape of a Black Hawk helicopter descending toward the empty lot adjacent to the diner. The pilot was bringing it down with a level of precision that spoke of thousands of hours of flight time, of operations in conditions far worse than a sleet storm in the American heartland. The skids were maybe 30 feet up now, 20, 10. I could see the individual rivets on the fuselage, could read the faded military stenciling that had been partially painted over but never quite erased. This bird had history, had seen combat, had been places that would never appear in any official record. I didn't let the kid go. If anything, I gripped him tighter, my fingers digging into his wrists hard enough to leave bruises that would last for days. I've seen enough in my time to know that when the heavy metal starts falling from the sky, the only thing that keeps you grounded is what you can hold on to. The kid was my anchor and my leverage, and I wasn't about to give up either. The pilot brought the bird down with a metallic screech as the skids touched the wet pavement, the suspension compressing and then settling. The side door slid open before the rotors even started to slow their rotation, and 3 men in full tactical gear dropped out into the mud and slush with practiced efficiency. They weren't wearing any insignia, no unit patches, no name tapes, no flag indicators that would identify nationality or branch of service. Their gear was top tier, the kind that doesn't show up in military surplus catalogs. They moved with synchronized precision, spreading out in a basic security formation that told me they'd done this hundreds of times before. They didn't have their weapons drawn, but they moved with the kind of controlled readiness that told me they didn't need them to kill me if that's what the situation required. Their hands hovered near their holsters, ready but not threatening, waiting for orders or for me to make a move that would force their hand. The kid started shouting, trying to pull away from my grip, his voice rising to a panicked pitch that cut through even the roar of the helicopter engines. "Over here! This old man, he attacked me, he assaulted me for no reason. He's got the scrambler, he's dangerous." The lead man stopped exactly 10 feet away, close enough to be threatening, but far enough to be outside of immediate physical reach. He was a mountain of a human being, easily 6'6" and probably 260 of solid muscle. His face was hidden behind a tactical mask and ballistic glasses, but I could feel the weight of his stare, could sense the assessment happening behind that anonymous facade. He didn't look at the kid who was still screaming and struggling. He looked at me, at my stance, my grip, my eyes. Then his gaze drifted down to my hand that was still pinned to the kid's wrist, and then lower, to the faded ink on my forearm that the struggle and the wet clothing had exposed. The tattoo was old, the lines slightly blurred by time and sun exposure. Most people wouldn't recognize it. It was deliberately obscure, a symbol that meant nothing to civilians. But to certain people who'd operated in certain theaters during certain time periods, it was as clear as a neon sign. The Redline unit crest, a designation that had been scrubbed from official records decades ago. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the helicopter engines. The mountain of a man stood perfectly still, the sleet lashing against his visor, running in rivulets down his tactical vest. The other 2 operators had stopped moving as well, frozen in their positions, waiting. Slowly, with deliberate care, the lead man reached up and pulled back his tactical mask, revealing his face to the harsh glare of the searchlight and the storm. The man's face was a map of old scars and deep-set lines, a topographical representation of a life lived in places where violence was currency and survival was never guaranteed. His eyes were what caught me, though. They were hard as flint and twice as cold, the eyes of a man who'd seen things that would break normal people and had simply catalogued them as data points to be filed away. But he didn't look like a man coming to save a friend. He looked like a man coming to do a job he didn't particularly like, a job that had just become significantly more complicated than the briefing had suggested. The kid was still squirming under my hand, his voice rising to a frantic, almost hysterical pitch, as the wind from the rotors whipped his expensive hair into his eyes. "Chief, What are you waiting for? Take him down! He's a nobody, just some grease monkey trucker who thinks he's a hero." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperation and entitlement mixing into a toxic cocktail. The lead soldier didn't move toward me. He didn't even acknowledge the kid's words. He just stared at my forearm, at the faded black ink of the Redline unit crest that only a handful of men still alive would recognize. The ink that marked me as part of operations that had never officially existed, missions that had been executed in the gaps between policy and necessity. The rain was stinging my eyes, mixing with the sweat and the adrenaline, but I didn't blink. I kept my weight centered, my boots planted firmly in the slush, ready for whatever came next. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, and I wasn't going down without making them feel every year of my experience, every lesson learned in dark places doing dark work. Then, the mountain of a man did something that made the kid's jaw literally drop open. He brought his heels together with a sharp click that was somehow audible even over the helicopter noise, and brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, textbook-perfect salute. The kind of salute that's been drilled into muscle memory until it's more reflex than conscious action. "Colonel Mercer," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the Black Hawk like a gunshot, clear and precise. "We didn't know you were in the area, sir." I felt the tension in my shoulders shift, but I didn't let go of the kid's wrist. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening, what the angles were. I looked at the man in the tactical gear, searching his face for recognition, running through mental files of operations and personnel until a memory clicked into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. A dusty extraction point outside of Kandahar. A young sergeant with fresh combat scars holding the line while mortars walked across the compound. A 20-hour firefight that had ended with more American casualties than the official report would ever acknowledge. "At ease, Miller," I grunted, my voice sounding like grinding stones, rough from the cold and the exertion. "And the rank is Jack now. Has been for 15 years. I'm just a guy hauling refrigerated produce and trying to get a quiet cup of coffee without drama." Miller dropped his hand from the salute, but his posture remained stiff, formal, the ingrained discipline of years of service keeping him locked in professional mode. He looked at the kid I had pinned against the SUV, the kid who was currently looking like he'd just watched his entire worldview shatter and reassemble itself into something he didn't recognize. "I take it the senator's son has been making a nuisance of himself again?" Miller asked, his eyes narrowing as he finally acknowledged the younger man's existence. There was no warmth in his voice, no sympathy, just a flat, professional assessment of a problem that needed solving. "Nuisance is one word for it," I said, finally releasing the kid's arm. He slumped against the car, his legs nearly giving out, leaving a smear of mud on the pristine paint job. "Assaulting an 82-year-old Vietnam veteran and a teenage waitress because he didn't like waiting for a coffee refill. That's another way to describe it." The kid tried to regain some of his bravado, smoothing his expensive jacket with trembling hands, trying to put himself back together into the image of power and authority he'd carried into the diner. "You can't talk to me like that. Miller, this is insubordination. Arrest him. He put his hands on me. I have rights. My father is on the Armed Services Committee. He'll have your career." Miller stepped forward, his massive frame blotting out the helicopter's searchlight, casting the kid in sudden shadow. He didn't arrest me. Instead, he grabbed the senator's son by the scruff of his neck, like you'd grab a misbehaving puppy, and shoved him toward the open door of the Black Hawk with enough force to send him sprawling into the cargo bay. "You have the right to remain silent, Brandon," Miller hissed, and there was real anger in his voice now, the kind that comes from having to clean up someone else's mess for the 100th time. "And if you say one more word before we reach the base, I'm going to forget that your father is on the oversight committee and remember that I've got a dozen witnesses who saw you assault civilians." He turned back to me, the rain dripping off the brim of his tactical helmet, running down his face in streams. His expression had softened marginally, respect replacing the cold professionalism. "I'm sorry about this, sir." He was supposed to be under observation during the transport to the psychiatric evaluation facility. He slipped away at the fuel stop, stole the duty vehicle. It won't happen again. The pieces clicked together. The expensive gear, the military radio, the signal jammer. This wasn't a kid out for a joyride. This was someone in the middle of a mental health crisis, someone with access to resources that made him dangerous in ways beyond just physical violence. "See that it doesn't," I said, my heart rate finally starting to settle from the sustained spike, dropping back towards something approaching normal. "And Miller? Tell his father that if I see him near a truck stop again, near any veteran trying to have a peaceful meal, I won't be so gentle. This was me being restrained." Miller nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin that conveyed understanding and agreement. "Understood, sir. And Colonel, it's good to see you're still in the fight, even if the battlefield's changed." He signaled to his team, a quick hand gesture that sent them into motion. They vanished back into the belly of the Black Hawk with the same efficiency they'd shown exiting it, the cargo door sliding shut with a hollow boom that echoed across the parking lot. The engine pitch increased to a deafening whine that made my ears ring, and the rotor wash intensified one final time, strong enough that I had to lean into it to keep my footing. The Black Hawk lifted off, nose dipping slightly as it gained altitude and speed, disappearing into the black, rain-swept sky as quickly as it had arrived. Within 30 seconds, it was just a memory, a set of fading red navigation lights being swallowed by the storm and the distance. I stood there for a long minute, maybe two, letting the silence of the parking lot return. The only sounds now were the steady idle of my Peterbilt and the splash of rain in the puddles, the normal soundtrack of 1,000 truck stops I'd been through over the years. My shoulder ached where the flashlight had hit me, a deep throb that would probably turn into a spectacular bruise by morning. My shin was already swelling where the kid had kicked me, and I could feel half a dozen other minor injuries, making themselves known as the adrenaline, continued to drain from my system. But the heat in my chest, that dangerous anger that had flared when I'd watched the kid kick Artie's cap across the floor, had cooled to steady, quiet embers. Not gone, never really gone, but banked and controlled. I turned back toward the diner, my boots squelching in the mud and slush. Every step a reminder that I wasn't 25 anymore, that these kinds of physical confrontations took a toll that would last for days. The neon sign was still flickering, still casting that restless red glow over the puddles I'd just rolled through while fighting for something that probably didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but mattered absolutely in this small moment. I still had half a cup of cold coffee waiting for me inside, and a veteran's hat that needed to be cleaned off and returned to its rightful owner. When I pushed the door open, the bell chimed with that same small, normal sound, a note of mundane normalcy that seemed completely out of place after helicopters and tactical teams. The silence inside was absolute and heavy. Every eye in the place was on me, taking in my soaked clothes, the mud streaking my jacket, the fresh bruises already forming. The two drivers at the counter had completely forgotten their eggs, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths. The elderly couple in the corner booth was staring openly, the woman's hand still clutching her husband's with white-knuckled intensity. The waitress was gripping a glass carafe like it was a life preserver, her eyes wide and glistening. I didn't say a word. I didn't offer explanations or reassurances. I just walked straight to the radiator where Artie's Vietnam veteran cap was still sitting in a pool of greasy, melted ice and road salt. I knelt down slowly, my joints popping and crackling like dry kindling, each small sound a reminder of age and mileage. I picked up the cap carefully, feeling the dampness of the fabric, the weight of what it represented. It was a simple thing when you got down to it, just cotton and thread and some faded embroidery. But it represented a lifetime of holding a line that most people don't even know exists, of standing between civilization and chaos, of paying prices that can't be calculated in dollars or metrics. I took a stack of napkins from a nearby dispenser and began to carefully dab away the oil and road salt, working with a gentleness that probably surprised the people watching. I could feel Artie's eyes on me from the booth, could sense the emotion radiating from him even without looking up. "You didn't have to go out there, Jack," he said after a long moment, his voice quiet but steady now, the tremor mostly gone. "Guys like that. They're like the weather. You just hunker down and wait for them to pass. You don't fight them. It never ends well." "Not this time, Artie," I replied, standing up with a grunt and walking over to him. I handed him the hat, settling it carefully on the table between us. It wasn't perfect. There were still faint stains that would probably never come out completely, but it was clean, it was respected. Some storms need a little help moving along. I sat back down in my booth, the vinyl groaning under my weight and my soaked clothing. My coffee was stone cold now, probably undrinkable, but I didn't care. I needed a moment to let the adrenaline fully drain out of my system, to feel my heart rate return to normal, to convince my hands to stop their slight trembling. The waitress approached tentatively, a fresh pot in her hand, her steps careful like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. She filled my mug without asking, her hand shaking just a little bit, coffee sloshing slightly over the rim. That helicopter," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the renewed hum of normal diner sounds as people slowly went back to their meals. "Who were you out there? What just happened?" I looked at my reflection in the dark surface of the fresh coffee, a tired man in a worn jacket with too many miles behind him and probably not enough ahead. My beard was graying faster than I liked to admit, and the lines around my eyes seemed to have deepened just in the last hour. I adjusted my sleeve to cover the Redline tattoo, tucking the ink back into invisibility where it belonged, where it had lived for 15 years. "Just a driver, ma'am," I said and meant it. "Just a driver who's seen enough to know the difference between a big man and a loud one." I pulled out my phone and checked my electronic log. The clock was ticking, and the load in my refrigerated trailer didn't care about senators' sons or military extractions or philosophical discussions about respect and dignity. I had 300 miles of blacktop between me and the drop-off point in Kansas City, and the weather forecast showed the sleet transitioning to full snow within the next 2 hours. I took a long pull of the hot coffee, feeling the heat spread down into my chest, chasing away the last of the cold that had seeped into my bones during the fight. The warmth was almost painful, that sharp contrast between frozen and thawed, but it was a good pain, a reminder that I was still alive, still functional. Before I stood up to leave, Artie reached across the table, his weathered hand extended palm up. He didn't say much. Men of his generation rarely do, just a firm clasp of his hand around mine and a slow nod of his head. But there was a look in his eyes that said more than words ever could, a recognition of a shared burden, of a brotherhood that doesn't need words to explain itself, that exists in the space between what was done and what needed to be done. I stood up, feeling every injury, every bruise, every year of wear and tear. I settled the bill with a generous tip for the girl, $50 on a $12 check, and walked out to where my Peterbilt was waiting in the storm, its headlights cutting 2 bright paths through the swirling darkness. As I climbed into the cab, the familiar scent of old leather and diesel wrapped around me like a shield, like coming home after a long deployment. I engaged the air brakes, the hiss of the release sounding like a long, tired sigh. I checked my mirrors out of habit, saw the diner shrinking in the distance as I pulled onto the highway, the neon sign growing smaller and smaller until it was just another pinpoint of light in an ocean of darkness. I shifted through the gears, feeling the weight of the load settle as the transmission found its rhythm. The road was empty at this hour, the lines on the pavement blurring into a single white ribbon under my tires, hypnotic and endless. The kid in the helicopter would have a long night of explanations ahead of him, psychiatric evaluations, official reports, probably legal consequences that his father's position could only partially shield him from. Miller was a good man. He wouldn't let the senator's son sweep this under the rug, not after seeing that unit crest, not after understanding what it meant. Justice on the road doesn't always come from a gavel or a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a man who refuses to look the other way when the world gets ugly. Sometimes it's delivered by the people who've seen the worst humanity has to offer and decided that they're going to hold the line anyway, even when it costs them, even when it hurts. I reached out and patted the dashboard of the Pete, the old ritual of connection between driver and machine. "Just you and me, girl," I muttered into the silence of the cab. "Let's get this load home." The highway stretched out ahead of me, a long dark road that never really ends, just transforms from one state to another, 1 mile marker to the next. I thought about Artie, sitting in that booth right now, finally wearing his hat again with the dignity he'd earned in jungles half a world away. It's a heavy thing, carrying the weight of the past, carrying the memories of what you've done and what you've seen. But tonight, for a few miles at least, that weight felt a little lighter. I'm just a man with a truck and a destination, hauling produce through a storm. But as long as there's a road to drive, I'll keep moving toward the next sunrise, watching the world through a windshield and holding the line whenever I'm called to. Thank you for watching. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.